How does an empire die? Not always with a single cataclysmic bang, but sometimes through 1,000 cuts inflicted from within. In the twilight of Rome, one woman stood at the epicenter of this slow, agonizing death. Her name was Galla Placidia. Raised as a pawn, she learned to play the game of power with a ruthlessness born of tragedy. This is the story of how her desperate struggle for survival, her manipulation of military titans, and the rebellion of her own daughter would unleash furies upon a crumbling world, leaving an empire in ashes and provoking the wrath of the Huns. Born in 392 AD, the blood that ran through Placidia's veins was the most purple in Rome. She was the daughter of the great emperor Theodosius I, the last man to rule a united Roman Empire. Her mother was his second wife, Galla, and her half-brothers, Arcadius and Honorius, were destined to inherit the world. From birth, Placidia was a priceless piece on the dynastic chessboard. Her childhood was spent in the suffocating luxury of the imperial court, a world of palace intrigues and smiles as sharp as daggers. She learned early on that her lineage was both a privilege and a gilded cage. Her father's death in 395 split the empire forever between her brothers. Honorius, an indolent and weak young man, became the emperor of the West, and the young Placidia was left under his tutelage in an increasingly dysfunctional and paranoid court, now established in the marshy and easily defended Ravenna. It was there, in the heart of a decaying power, that fate knocked on her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In the year 410, the unthinkable happened. After years of threats and failed negotiations, the Visigothic king Alaric and his hordes broke through the walls of Rome itself. For 3 days, the Eternal City, the beacon of the world for a millennium, was sacked. Amid the chaos and carnage, the Goths seized a prize more valuable than all the gold in the capital: the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia. At 22, her princess life was shattered. She became a hostage, a captive dragged through the Italian peninsula with the caravan of the barbarian conquerors. One can imagine her terror, the humiliation, the cold, and the hunger. But inside that terrified young woman, a core of steel was being forged. She watched, she learned, and she survived. She was not a passive prisoner. She was an intelligent observer of her captors, studying their language, their customs, and above all, their leaders. Alaric died shortly after, but his successor, his brother-in-law Adolf, saw in Placidia much more than a mere hostage. He saw legitimacy, the power of Theodosius's name. And according to the chronicles, he also saw the woman. In a twist that scandalized the Roman world, in the year 414, in Narbo, southern Gaul, Galla Placidia, the princess of Rome, married Adolf, the king of the Visigoths. It was no fairy tale. It was the most audacious political calculation of her life, a desperate gamble to turn her victimhood into a position of power. Placidia dreamed of a future where Gothic strength and Roman culture could merge, creating a new order from the ashes of the old. Ataulf, influenced by her, declared that he no longer wished to destroy the Roman Empire, but to restore it with the strength of his people. At that wedding, Placidia was not the captive bride, but the architect of a new era. From their union, a son was born, Theodosius, named in honor of his illustrious grandfather. This child represented the embodiment of her dream, an emperor with Roman and Gothic blood. But happiness was a fleeting mirage. The child died within months, a devastating blow that seemed to portend the tragedy to come. Shortly after, in 415, Adolf was assassinated in the streets of Barcelona by a servant loyal to a Gothic rival. Placidia's dream turned into a nightmare. The new Visigothic king, Sigeric, subjected her to the ultimate humiliation. He forced her to walk more than 12 miles on foot alongside other captives. Her status had evaporated. She was once again a prisoner, a widow, and childless, her life hanging by the thinnest of threads. However, her brother Honorius, despite his ineptitude, could not allow the blood of Theodosius to remain in barbarian hands. After just 1 week, Sigeric was also assassinated, and his successor, Wallia, negotiated Placidia's return in exchange for a huge shipment of grain for his starving people. In 416, Galla Placidia returned to the heart of Roman power, but she was no longer the young woman who had been taken. She had seen the world beyond the palace walls. She had been queen of the Goths, and she had watched her dreams die. She returned wiser, harder, and above all, more ambitious. Honorius wasted no time. Barely a year after her return, he forced her to marry one of his most brilliant and ambitious generals, Flavius Constantius. Placidia resisted, disgusted by the idea of joining a man she considered an upstart. But the emperor's will was law. This marriage, though unhappy for her, was politically fruitful. It gave her 2 children, a daughter, Justa Grata Honoria, and a son, Valentinian, the future heir to the throne. Constantius, thanks to his union with Placidia, was elevated to the rank of co-emperor in 421, becoming Constantius III. Galla Placidia was now, officially, Augusta, Empress of the West. However, power was ephemeral. Constantius died of illness just 7 months later, leaving Placidia a widow for the second time, but in a much stronger position. She was the mother of the heir. Her relationship with her brother Honorius, always tense, deteriorated rapidly. A power struggle erupted in Ravenna, with factions of both clashing in the streets. The situation became so untenable that Placidia, accused of conspiring against her own brother, was exiled in 423 along with her children. She sought refuge in the only place possible, the court of her nephew Theodosius II in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire. It seemed like another defeat, another humiliating exile. But fate once again intervened. That same year, her inept brother Honorius died without an heir. The throne of the West was vacant, and a usurper named Joannes seized power in Ravenna. For Theodosius II, this was unacceptable. The only legitimate heir of the Theodosian dynasty was his aunt, Galla Placidia, and her young son, Valentinian. With the massive backing of the Eastern army, Placidia sailed back to Italy. She was not returning as a supplicant exile, but as the head of an invading force, the legitimate empress coming to claim the throne for her son. The campaign was swift. The usurper Joannes was captured, publicly humiliated, and executed in 425. Galla Placidia entered Ravenna in triumph. Her 6-year-old son, Valentinian III, was proclaimed Augustus, emperor of the Western Roman Empire. But everyone knew who held the real power. For the next 12 years, Galla Placidia ruled as Augusta and regent. But her reign would not be an era of peace, but rather a web of paranoia, betrayal, and clandestine civil war. The empire was crumbling, and Placidia, at its center, was forced to manage the wolves guarding the henhouse. Her main threats were not the barbarians at the borders, but her own generals, 2 military titans named Bonifacius and Flavius Aetius. Aetius, the last of the Romans, was a cunning and ruthless military genius who had spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns, learning their tactics and forging personal loyalties with them. He commanded the armies of Gaul. Bonifacius, the Count of Africa, was equally competent and controlled the empire's most vital province, the source of Rome's grain. Placidia, sitting in Ravenna, knew she could trust neither of them. Her power depended on keeping them at each other's throats. Here began the most dangerous game of her life. History, written by the victors, tells us a plot of intrigue worthy of a tragedy. It is said that Aetius, from Gaul, poisoned Placidia's mind against Bonifacius. He wrote to her in secret, warning her that the Count of Africa planned to assassinate her and seize power. As proof, he suggested she summon him to Ravenna. His refusal, Aetius assured her, would confirm his treason. At the same time, the conspirator Aetius sent a messenger to Bonifacius in Carthage. The letter warned the general that Placidia planned to execute him and that the summons to Ravenna was a death trap. Caught between two generals whose ambition was as great as their armies, Placidia took the bait. Or perhaps she simply saw an opportunity to eliminate one of the threats. She summoned Bonifacius. He, fearing for his life, refused. For Placidia, this was the confirmation she needed. She declared Bonifacius a public enemy and sent an army to crush him. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Bonifacius, cornered, made a decision that would seal the fate of the Western Empire. In 429, he invited the Vandals of King Gaiseric to cross from Hispania into Africa as his mercenaries. The Vandals came, but not as allies. There were 80,000 of them, and they saw a rich, poorly defended land ripe for the taking. They rampaged through the province, burning, looting, and slaughtering. Bonifacius, realizing his terrible mistake, tried to fight them, but it was too late. Rome's breadbasket was on fire. Placidia, horrified, reconciled with Bonifacius, but the damage was irreparable. The general returned to Italy, defeated but forgiven, and Placidia elevated him to Magister Militum, the supreme commander, stripping Aetius of his title. It was a direct challenge. Aetius, furious, marched his legions from Gaul into Italy. In 432, at the Battle of Ravenna, Rome's two best generals clashed in a civil war. Bonifacius won the battle but paid the ultimate price. He was mortally wounded by a spear thrown by Aetius himself. Aetius fled to his estates and then to his old friends, the Huns. Placidia had won, but her champion lay dead. A few months later, Aetius returned, not alone, but at the head of a vast Hunnic army. Placidia had no choice. She was forced to pardon the man who had caused the loss of Africa and killed her general. Aetius was restored to his post and became, without dispute, the power behind the throne, the true ruler of the empire. Placidia's game had failed. She had tried to play the wolves against each other, and the strongest of them had devoured her politically. She lived to see one last family drama. Her own daughter, Honoria, in an act of desperate rebellion against an arranged marriage, sent her ring to the fearsome Attila the Hun, asking him to rescue her. Attila interpreted this as a marriage proposal and claimed half of the Western Empire as a dowry, a pretext that contributed to his devastating invasion. Galla Placidia died in Rome in 450, just before Attila unleashed his fury on Italy, a final bitter irony. She was buried in the imperial mausoleum at St. Peter's Basilica. Her life was not that of an empire builder, but of the receiver of its bankruptcy. She was a pawn, a queen, an exile, and a regent, but each of her triumphs was paid for with blood and with a piece of the Roman world. She outlived all her enemies, but she ruled over an empire in ruins, an empress seated on a throne of ashes.